The morning sun rose over the city streets, casting long shadows between tall buildings. Harold Jenkins took a deep breath of the fresh morning air as he unfolded his worn metal table at the corner of Main and Oak Street. His fingers, knotted, with arthritis, moved slowly but surely as they had done every day for the past 5 years. The corner was his spot. Everyone knew it. From the coffee shop workers who brought him a hot cup each morning to the bus driver, who honked and waved as he passed. Harold was 72 years old now, his back a little more stooped than when he'd first started selling his flags. His hair had thinned to wispy white strands beneath his faded blue veteran's cap, with the Vietnam service ribbon pinned carefully to the front. Deep wrinkles lined his face, each one telling stories of hard years lived with quiet dignity. Another day, another dollar, he mumbled to himself, the old saying bringing a small smile to his weathered face. From the large canvas bag he carried, Harold pulled out his treasures, handmade American flags of all sizes. Some were simple stars and stripes, sewn with careful precision. Others featured military emblems, the Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, and Coast Guard. Each stitch was placed with care, each color chosen to match exactly what the flag should be. These weren't cheap printed flags. These were works of craft, made by hands that had once carried an M16 through steamy jungles half a world away. As Harold arranged his display, he thought about his dog waiting at home. Major was an old golden retriever, nearly blind now but still wagging his tail whenever Harold walked through the door of his small one-bedroom apartment. "Got to sell at least 3 flags today," Harold whispered to himself. "Major needs that. Special food for his teeth and the rent's due next week." What most people who bought Harold's flags didn't know was that half of what he made went straight to the Veterans Haven shelter across town. Harold had spent 3 months there himself when he first came home from the war, lost and unsure how, to live in a world that had moved on without him. Now he did what he could to help others like him. The morning crowd began to build as the clock hit 8. Office workers rushed by with coffee cups and cell phones, most too busy to notice the old man with his flags. Harold didn't mind. He knew the regular buyers would come, the people who understood what the flag meant, what it had cost men like him. "Morning, Harold," called a woman in a postal worker's uniform. Her name was Judy, and she bought a flag every year on her father's birthday. Her dad had been in Vietnam too, but he hadn't made it home. "Morning, Judy. Got a nice new one for you this year," Harold replied, pulling out a small flag with the Postal Service Eagle emblem sewn next to the stars. "Thought you might like this one." Judy's eyes widened, and for a moment Harold thought she might cry. "It's perfect," she said, handing over $30. "Dad would have loved it." Those moments kept Harold going through the long hours standing on the corner. His back would ache and his hands would stiffen up, but seeing faces light up made it worthwhile. By midday, the sun was high overhead, beating down on the pavement. Harold wiped sweat from his forehead with an old handkerchief that had once belonged to his father. The heat was worse than usual today, making his old injuries throb. The bullet he'd taken in his right thigh back in '68 always knew when rain was coming, and today it was sending signals loud and clear. A young mother stopped by, pushing a stroller with a sleeping baby inside. She didn't buy anything but asked if she could sit in the small patch of shade created by Harold's umbrella. Harold nodded, offering her his folding chair. "You look like you need it more than me," he said kindly. They talked while the baby slept. Her husband was deployed overseas, his 3rd tour. Harold listened as she shared her worries, her fears, her pride. Before she left, she bought a small flag with the Army emblem. "To show him we're thinking of him," she explained. Harold slipped an extra small flag into her bag when she wasn't looking, a tiny one perfect for a child's hand. As the lunch hour approached, business picked up slightly. A businessman in an expensive suit bought a flag for his father's grave. A teacher bought 3 small ones for her classroom. An older couple, tourists from somewhere with an accent Harold couldn't quite place, bought one as a souvenir. By 2 o'clock, the day had grown uncomfortably hot. Harold's shirt stuck to his back and his water bottle was nearly empty. The street had grown quieter as people retreated indoors to escape the heat. Harold checked his watch. Just 2 more hours until he could pack up and head home to Major. "Hiwam," Counted the day's earnings so far, 127. Not bad, but not great either. After giving half to the shelter, he'd have just enough for Major's special food and maybe a little left over for the rent jar. The electric bill would have to wait another week. Harold adjusted his cap and straightened his display again. The smallest flags had sold well today, but the larger ones, the ones that took him days to complete, still remained on the table. They were his finest work, with reinforced edges that wouldn't fray and colors that wouldn't fade in the sun. Each star was perfectly aligned, each stripe exactly the right width. These were flags meant to last a lifetime, to be passed down through generations. A school bus stopped at the light, and children pressed their faces against the windows, pointing at his colorful display. Harold waved, and they waved back, their small hands fluttering like birds. That sight never failed to make him smile. Those children were why he'd fought all those years ago, even if they'd never know it. The light changed, and the bus pulled away. Harold looked down the now empty street, feeling the familiar ache in his joints warning him that he should sit down soon. But there was no time for rest, not when there were flags to sell and bills to pay. He didn't do this for thanks or recognition. He did it because it kept his hands busy and his mind clear. Each flag was a small piece of himself, a reminder that he was still here, still contributing something to the country he had served. The afternoon stretched ahead, long and hot, but Harold Jenkins stood tall at his corner, surrounded by the flags he had made with his own two hands, waiting for the next customer, the next story, the next moment of connection, in a world that too often rushed by without noticing. The afternoon sun beat down on Harold's corner with fierce intensity. Sweat trickled down the back of his neck as he sipped lukewarm water from his old metal thermos. Business had slowed to a crawl during these hot afternoon hours. Most people were either still at work or hiding in air-conditioned buildings trying to escape the heat. Harold dabbed at his forehead with a handkerchief, wincing as he shifted his weight from one leg to the other. His right knee had been giving him trouble lately, another old war souvenir that acted up in extreme weather. Still, he wouldn't leave his post early. He never did. An ice cream truck passed by, its cheerful melody floating on the hot air. Harold watched a few children run after it, their laughter a welcome sound in the quiet afternoon. His mind drifted to memories of his own childhood, chasing similar trucks down dusty neighborhood streets, back before war and life had changed. Everything. The quiet was broken by the sound of loud voices and laughter. A group of 5 young men turned the corner, heading in Harold's direction. They wore expensive clothes, designer jeans, flashy watches, sunglasses that probably cost more than Harold made in 2 weeks. The smell of beer followed them as they walked, their movements loose and careless. Harold straightened up a bit, putting on what his late wife used to call his customer smile. Young folks didn't buy flags often, but you never knew. Maybe they had veterans in their families. "Afternoon, gentlemen," Harold greeted them as they approached his table. "Looking for a flag today?" The tallest of the group, a broad-shouldered, young man with perfectly styled hair, looked Harold up and down with an amused expression. He nudged the friend beside him. "Hey, check out Grandpa Patriot over here," he said loudly enough for Harold to hear. The others snickered, forming a half-circle around Harold's small display. "What's with all the flags, old-timer? 4th of July was last month," another one called out. He wore a gold chain around his neck that caught the sunlight, flashing it into Harold's eyes. Harold kept his smile in place, though it had tightened around the edges. "I sell them year-round. People need flags for all sorts of reasons." "Like what?" asked a third young man, pulling out his phone and pointing it toward Harold. "Who buys flags from a street corner when you can get them online?" The question wasn't entirely hostile, but Harold could sense they weren't really interested in the answer. Still, he responded politely as he always did. "People who care about how they're made. Each one is hand-sewn. Takes about 4 hours for the smaller ones, up to 2 days for the big ones with special emblems." The young men exchanged glances, smirks forming on their faces. The one with the phone was now clearly recording video. 4 hours? That's why you're out here sweating all day? Dude, they make these things in factories in like 5 minutes. The tall one stepped closer, picking up one of Harold's larger flags, a beautifully crafted piece with the Marine Corps emblem, carefully sewn alongside the stars. He held it up carelessly, letting one corner drag on the ground. Harold flinched but kept his voice steady. "Careful with that one, please. It's special order." "How much for this thing anyway?" the young man asked, flipping the price tag with his finger. $35, Harold answered. "The specialty emblems take extra time." The group erupted in laughter. $35? For real? I could get the same thing at Walmart for like $8. Harold felt a tightness in his chest but kept his expression neutral. "Those machine-made flags won't last a year before the colors fade or the seams start coming apart. Mine are guaranteed for life." "Lifetime guarantee from a guy who looks like he's on his last legs?" one of them muttered, causing another burst of laughter. The tall one tossed the flag back onto the table where it landed in a crumpled heap. Harold immediately reached to smooth it out, his weathered hands working to straighten the fabric he'd spent hours perfecting. "You're ripping people off, man," the young man said, shaking his head. "No wonder your business is so dead." He gestured to the empty street around them. Another member of the group stepped forward, picking up a small flag and examining it with exaggerated scrutiny. "Why is this little one $20? It's tiny," Harold explained patiently. "The small ones still take precision work. Each star has to be perfect," the young man interrupted in a mocking, high-pitched voice. "We get it. You're very patriotic." He set the flag down much harder than necessary. The one filming zoomed in closer on Harold's face. "Hey, you should be on TikTok, old-timer. Day in the life of a flagman. Might actually make some real money." Harold said nothing, simply continuing to rearrange his display. His silence seemed to irritate them. "What's wrong? Don't know what TikTok is?" The young man turned to his friends. "Probably thinks it's some kind of clock, right, guys?" More laughter. Harold's hands had begun to tremble slightly, though whether from anger or hurt he couldn't say. He'd faced worse than this in his life, much worse. But something about the casual cruelty cut deep. These boys had no idea what the flag meant to men like him, what it had cost. The tall one stepped back, his eyes falling on Harold's small cash box. It was nothing fancy, just a metal box with a simple lock, sitting at the corner of the table. Inside was the day's earnings, barely enough to cover what Harold needed. "So how's business really going, flagman? Making millions out here?" He reached over and flipped open the box before Harold could stop him. Inside were a few bills and some change, perhaps $40 in total. The young man whistled low. "Wow, business is booming." "Please don't touch that," Harold said firmly, reaching for the box. The young man stepped back, raising his hands with a smirk. "Just curious about your enterprise here." As he moved, his elbow, perhaps accidentally, perhaps not, caught the edge of the box, knocking it off the table. The box hit the sidewalk with a loud clatter, the lid popping open. Bills and coins scattered across the concrete and into the street. A $5 bill caught the breeze, floating toward the gutter. "Oops," the young man said with exaggerated innocence. "My bad." Harold stared down at his scattered earnings, knowing he would have to kneel down to pick them up. With his bad knee, getting back up wouldn't be easy, especially not with an audience enjoying his struggle. "Maybe this is a sign you should find a new career," one of them suggested, not offering to help. "Ever thought about greeting at Walmart? They hire old folks like you." The one filming zoomed in on the money on the ground. "This is going to get so many views," he muttered to his friend. Harold took a deep breath and slowly lowered himself to one knee, trying to hide the wince of pain as he began gathering the scattered bills and coins. A quarter rolled under the table. A $1 bill had landed in a small puddle left by a passing car. The young men watched, some looking slightly uncomfortable now, but none moving to help. Their laughter had quieted, but their presence remained, hovering over Harold as he collected what little he had. Then came the sound that would change everything, the deep rumble of a powerful engine pulling up to the curb. The deep rumble of a powerful engine caught everyone's attention. A gleaming black Chevrolet Suburban with tinted windows rolled to a stop directly in front of Harold's flag stand. The vehicle was immaculate, not a speck of dust on its polished surface despite the city heat. The young men paused their mockery, turning toward the impressive SUV with curious expressions. Even Harold, still on one knee gathering his scattered money, looked up at the vehicle. The engine purred for a moment, before falling silent. For several seconds, nothing happened. The tinted windows revealed nothing of who might be inside. Then, with a soft click, the back passenger door opened slowly. A pair of well-worn cowboy boots appeared first, touching down on the hot pavement. They were brown leather, scuffed from years of actual use, not the shiny decorative kind worn by people who'd never been on a ranch. The young men took a half-step back, making room as a man stepped fully out of the vehicle. He stood straight and tall despite his years, wearing faded jeans and a simple button-up shirt. His face was instantly recognizable. The strong jawline, the piercing eyes, and that expression of calm authority that had made him a legend both on and off the screen. Chuck Norris had arrived. At 85, his hair was whiter now, his face more lined than in his action movie prime, but there was no mistaking who he was. The years had been kind to him. He still carried himself with the unmistakable presence of someone who had spent decades mastering martial arts. His movements were deliberate and controlled as he surveyed the scene before him. A complete silence fell over the street corner. The young men froze in place, their phones now hanging limply at their sides or raised to capture this unexpected moment. Harold remained on one knee, a few crumpled bills clutched in his weathered hand, his eyes wide with surprise. Norris took in everything at a glance. The old veteran kneeling painfully on the sidewalk, the scattered money, the rumpled flags on the table, and the group of young men standing awkwardly nearby. His expression gave away nothing as he closed the SUV door behind him. Without a word, he walked over to Harold and extended his hand. It wasn't a handshake he was offering. It was help standing up. "Afternoon, soldier," Norris said, his voice carrying just enough for everyone to hear. Harold hesitated only for a moment before taking the offered hand. "Afternoon, sir," he replied, his voice steadier than he felt. With surprising strength for a man his age, Norris helped Harold to his feet. Harold winced slightly as his bad knee straightened, but he managed to stand tall, almost at attention, the way old habits from military service never quite leave a person. "Thank you," Harold said quietly. Norris nodded, then bent down himself to pick up some of the scattered coins and bills. He moved with the same fluid grace that had made him famous, though perhaps a touch slower than in his prime. One of the young men, the one who had been filming, let out an audible gasp. "Holy, that's Chuck Norris," he whispered loudly to his friends as if they couldn't see for themselves. Another one elbowed him to be quiet, but it was too late. Norris had heard him. He looked up from gathering Harold's money, fixing the group, with a steady gaze that had intimidated movie villains for decades. "Yes, it is," he said simply, continuing to pick up the coins. The young men shifted uncomfortably from foot to foot, suddenly conscious of what they had been doing moments before this legendary figure arrived. The tall one, who had knocked over the cash box, looked especially uncomfortable. "We were just, he began, but his voice trailed off as Norris straightened up, the recovered money in his hand. "I could see what you were doing," Norris said, his tone neutral but his eyes conveying disappointment. He handed the recovered cash to Harold, who accepted it with a nod of thanks. "These are beautiful flags," Norris commented, turning to examine Harold's display. He picked up one with an Army Ranger tab sewn alongside the stars and stripes, handling it with respect, carefully examining the stitching. "Expert craftsmanship." "Thank you, sir," Harold replied, his chest puffing slightly with pride despite his earlier humiliation. "Each one is hand-sewn." Norris nodded appreciatively. "I can tell. My father was a mechanic in the Army, served in World War II. He always said you could tell a lot about a person by the quality of their work." The mention of his father seemed to soften something in Norris's expression. He turned back to Harold. "How long have you been making these?" "Started about 5 years ago after my wife passed," Harold explained, straightening his display with careful hands. "Needed something to keep my hands busy and my mind occupied." Norris nodded in understanding. My father was the same way. Never could sit still. As the two older men talked, the young men stood awkwardly to the side, clearly unsure what to do. Their earlier bravado had evaporated completely. The one with the phone had stopped filming, though he kept glancing at Norris as if hoping for a chance to ask for a photo. "Actually," Norris continued, "I've been looking for you." Harold blinked in surprise. "For me? A buddy of mine from the Rangers bought one of your flags last month. Brought it to a reunion we both attended." Norris gestured to the flag he was still holding. He said it was the finest craftsmanship he'd seen in years. Said I should look you up if I was ever in town. Harold's weathered face brightened with modest pride. "I remember him. Tall fellow. Scar above his right eye." "That's Bill," Norris confirmed with a slight smile. "Said he hung your flag in his study. Shows it off to everyone who visits." As they spoke, one of the young men, the one who had been filming, took a tentative step forward. He cleared his throat nervously. "Excuse me. Mr. Norris, sir?" he said. "Could we possibly, would it be okay if we got a photo with you?" The request hung in the air for a moment. Norris turned slowly to face the group. His expression wasn't angry, but it held a certain sternness that made the young men straighten their postures almost instinctively. "You can get a photo," Norris said finally, "after you clean up this mess and apologize to this gentleman." The young men looked at each other, embarrassment evident on their faces. "And," Norris added, "after you've shown proper respect for what this man does and what he represents." For a moment, no one moved. Then the tall one, the apparent leader of the group, stepped forward. His earlier swagger was gone, replaced by genuine contrition. "Sir," he said, addressing Harold directly, "I'm really sorry for how we behaved. It was disrespectful and wrong." Harold studied the young man's face, seeing what looked like genuine remorse. He nodded slightly, accepting the apology without words. The young man knelt down to gather the remaining scattered coins, his friends, quickly joining him. As they worked, the rumble of another vehicle approaching caught everyone's attention. A second black SUV pulled up behind the first. The driver's window rolled down, revealing a man in a suit who nodded respectfully to Norris. "Your schedule, sir," the man reminded gently. "The Veterans Charity event starts in an hour." Norris nodded in acknowledgement but didn't move to leave. Instead, he turned back to Harold. "How many flags do you have left today?" he asked. Harold glanced at his display. 27, he answered. "It's been a slow day." Norris looked at the young men who had finished collecting the scattered money and now stood awkwardly waiting for further instructions. "Gentlemen," Norris said, "I believe you have some purchasing to do." The young men looked at each other with uncertainty, then back at Chuck Norris. His words weren't a suggestion. They carried the weight of an expectation that would not be ignored. 27 flags? The tall one asked, doing some quick mental math. "That's a lot." Norris just looked at him, one eyebrow slightly raised. We'd be happy to buy some." The young man corrected himself quickly. He turned to his friends. "Right, guys?" The others nodded, suddenly eager to please. The one who had been filming earlier reached for his wallet first. "I've got about $80 on me," he offered. "I've got 120, another added. The tall one pulled out his own wallet. "I've got my credit card if we need more." Harold watched this sudden change with a mixture of surprise and caution. He wasn't sure if this was just another form of mockery or something genuine. He'd seen plenty of false kindness in his lifetime. Norris seemed to sense Harold's hesitation. "These flags," he said, addressing the young men while picking up one of the larger pieces, "aren't just pieces of cloth. They're symbols of sacrifice. Each star, each stripe, represents something that many of you have never had to think about." His voice wasn't loud, but it commanded attention. Even a couple of passers-by had stopped to listen. "The man who made them," Norris continued, gesturing toward Harold, "understands that sacrifice firsthand. When you disrespect his work, you're disrespecting a whole lot more than just him." The young men looked genuinely chastened now. The tall one stepped forward again, this time with a different kind of confidence, not the false bravado from before, but something more thoughtful. "Sir," he said to Harold, not to Norris. "What branch did you serve in?" Harold straightened his shoulders slightly. "Army, 25th Infantry Division, Vietnam." The young man nodded slowly. "My grandfather was in Vietnam. He didn't talk about it much before he passed." Something changed in Harold's expression, a subtle softening around the eyes. "Most of us don't," he said quietly. "Would you?" The young man hesitated, then continued. "Would you mind telling us a bit about your service while we look at the flags? I'd like to know which one might have been most meaningful to my grandfather." Harold studied the young man's face for a moment, looking for any trace of the earlier mockery. Finding none, he nodded slightly. "The 25th was in the Central Highlands mostly," Harold began as he moved behind his table. His hand, steady now, picked up a flag with an infantry insignia. "We called ourselves Tropic Lightning." As Harold spoke, the young men gathered around his table, listening with unexpected interest. They asked questions about the different military emblems on the specialty flags, about what each symbol meant. Gradually, the conversation shifted from Harold's past to his craft. "Each star is exactly the same size," Harold explained, showing them the detailed stitching. "That's important. All equal, all united. Takes patience to get that right." "How long did it take you to learn to make them this well?" one of them asked. "Still learning," Harold replied with a small smile. "Every day still learning." As the young men examined the flags, they began to select ones to purchase. What started as obligation shifted to genuine interest. The tall one chose a flag with the Army emblem for his grandfather. Another selected a Navy flag for his uncle. One by one, they made their choices, handling the flags with a new respect. Chuck Norris stood to the side, watching this transformation, with quiet approval. The driver from the second SUV approached him discreetly. "Sir, we really should be going soon," he murmured. Norris nodded but held up one finger. "Just a minute more." The young men had pooled their money together and were counting it out on Harold's table. The tall one looked up at Harold. "Sir, we can cover 22 of your flags. Would it be all right if we came back for the others later this week? I get paid on Friday." Before Harold could answer, Norris stepped forward. "I'll take the other 5, he said, pulling out his wallet. Harold began to protest. "Mr. Norris, that's not necessary. It's not charity," Norris interrupted gently. "I need gifts for some people at the event I'm heading to. Veterans would appreciate these more than anything I could buy in a store." Harold hesitated, then nodded his acceptance. Norris selected 5 flags, including the Ranger one he'd been examining earlier. As Harold carefully wrapped each flag for his customers, the atmosphere on that street corner had transformed completely. The young men who had arrived laughing at him were now listening intently as he explained how to properly care for the flags to make them last. "Never put them in a dryer," Harold advised. "Air dry only, and iron on low heat if needed." The young men nodded, taking in his instructions as seriously as if they were in a classroom. When all the flags had been paid for and wrapped, the tall young man stepped forward again, extending his hand to Harold. "Thank you, sir," he said with genuine respect. "My grandfather would have appreciated meeting you." Harold shook his hand firmly. "Sounds like he raised you right in the end." The young man flushed slightly but nodded. "I haven't always acted like it, but yeah, he did his best." The others stepped up to shake Harold's hand as well. Then, almost as an afterthought, the one who had been filming earlier turned to Norris. "Mr. Norris, if it's still okay, could we get that photo now?" Norris looked at Harold, who gave a slight nod of approval. "All right," Norris agreed, "but Harold should be in it too." The young men enthusiastically agreed, and Harold found himself standing between Chuck Norris and the group that had mocked him just 30 minutes earlier. The irony wasn't lost on him, but there was something else there too, something that felt a bit like hope. As the young man held up his phone to take the selfie, Harold did something he rarely did in photos. He smiled. Not the customer service smile he used all day, but a genuine one that reached his eyes. After the photo, the young men thanked both Harold and Norris again before departing, their arms full of carefully wrapped flags. They walked away different from how they had arrived, a bit quieter, a bit more thoughtful. Norris turned to Harold once they were gone. "Those boys needed that lesson more than they knew," he said. Harold nodded. "We all need reminding sometimes." Norris checked his watch. "I really do need to get to this event, but I meant what I said about your craftsmanship. My friend wasn't exaggerating." "Thank you, sir," Harold replied. "Means a lot coming from you." Norris began to reach into his pocket. "I'd like to—" Harold held up a hand, stopping him. "You've done more than enough already." Norris studied the older veteran for a moment, then nodded in understanding. Some forms of charity, no matter how well-intentioned, could feel like pity to a proud man. Instead, Norris pulled out a business card and handed it to Harold. "My manager's contact information. When you make more flags, we'd like to order some. Properly, at full price." Harold took the card carefully as if it were made of something precious. "I'll do that." As Norris turned to leave, Harold called after him. "Mr. Norris?" Norris paused, looking back. "Those boys," Harold said. "They're not bad kids, really. Just thoughtless." Norris smiled slightly. "They're a bit better now than they were an hour ago." With that, he returned to his waiting SUV. The driver held the door open, and Norris climbed in with a final nod to Harold. The powerful vehicle pulled away from the curb, leaving Harold alone at his now empty table. Harold looked down at the business card in his hand, then at his empty display. For the first time in 5 years, he had sold out completely before closing time. He began to fold up his table with a strange feeling in his chest, something that felt a lot like pride. Harold Jenkins woke up earlier than usual the next morning. For the first time in years, he wasn't heading to his corner to sell flags. He had nothing left to sell. His entire inventory had been purchased the day before, leaving him with an unexpected problem. A good problem, but a problem nonetheless. He needed to make more flags, and quickly. As he made his morning coffee, his old retriever Major lounged at his feet, sensing something different about the day. Harold reached down to scratch behind the dog's ears. "Different kind of day today, old boy," he said softly. Different kind of day. He sat at his small kitchen table and pulled out Chuck Norris's manager's business card, turning it over in his weathered hands. Part of him still couldn't believe what had happened yesterday. It felt like a dream, the kind of story no one would believe if he told it. After finishing his coffee, Harold walked to his spare bedroom, which he had converted into a workshop years ago. Rolls of fabric lined one wall, reds, whites, and blues of various shades and textures. His sewing machine, an old, reliable Singer that had belonged to his late wife, sat ready on a sturdy table by the window. Beside it, neat boxes contained threads, scissors, measuring tools, and all the emblems he had carefully crafted for his specialty flags. Harold ran his fingers across the fabrics, thinking about how many more flags he could make with what he had on hand. Not enough. Not nearly enough if Chuck Norris's manager actually called with an order. He would need to buy more supplies, and that meant spending some of yesterday's unexpected windfall. As he was considering this, his phone rang. It was an unfamiliar number. Harold answered with caution. "Hello? Harold Jenkins speaking." "Mr. Jenkins, this is Tom Wilson, Chuck Norris's manager. Chuck asked me to call you about an order of flags." Harold's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't actually expected the call to come so soon, or at all, really. "Yes, sir, what kind of order did you have in mind?" "We're hosting a charity event for veterans next month. We'd like to order 50 of your flags, the specialty ones with different military emblems. Can you fulfill an order that size?" Harold did some quick mental math. 50 flags would take weeks of work, especially the specialty ones. But the money would be more than he usually made in 3 months of standing on that corner. "I can do it," Harold said firmly, determination settling in his chest. "I'll need some time, though." "Of course, we're looking at 4 weeks from now. Would that work?" "Yes, sir, that would work just fine." After hanging up, Harold sat in stunned silence for a moment. Then, with newfound purpose, he began to plan his day. He needed to buy supplies, reorganize his workshop, and figure out a production schedule. There was no time to waste. But first, he had one more call to make. He dialed the number for Veterans Haven, the shelter where he donated half his earnings. "Mike, it's Harold. I'm going to make a larger donation this month." Meanwhile, across town, something unexpected was happening. The young men who had mocked Harold had posted their selfie with him and Chuck Norris online. The photo showed all of them holding Harold's flags, with a caption explaining what had happened and admitting their shameful behavior. They had tagged Chuck Norris's official accounts, not expecting anything to come of it. They were wrong. By that evening, the post had gone viral. Chuck Norris had shared it himself, adding a simple comment: "Respect for our veterans isn't optional. It's necessary." Harold Jenkins embodies the spirit of service that built this nation. Local news stations picked up the story, and by the following morning, reporters were trying to track down the flag-making veteran who had earned Chuck Norris's respect. Harold knew none of this as he went about his day, visiting fabric stores and supply shops, carefully selecting the best materials for his new orders. It wasn't until he returned home in the late afternoon that he noticed the blinking light on his rarely used answering machine. 27 messages. Bewildered, Harold played the first few. There were calls from 3 different local news stations, a national morning show, and several people he didn't know asking if he was the flagman from the internet. The last message was from the tall young man who had led the mocking the day before. "Mr. Jenkins, it's Bobby from yesterday. Well, our picture kind of went everywhere, and people are looking for you. I wanted to warn you before reporters showed up at your corner. Call me if you need anything." Harold sat heavily in his kitchen chair, trying to make sense of this development. Major nudged his hand, sensing his confusion. The phone rang again. Harold hesitated, then answered. It was the director of Veterans Haven. "Harold, have you seen the news? You're everywhere. We've had dozens of calls asking how people can donate to help veterans like you. This could be huge for the shelter." Harold listened as the director explained how the story had touched people, how the shelter was receiving attention it had never had before. Something warm spread through Harold's chest. Not pride exactly, but a sense that perhaps something bigger than himself was happening. Over the next few days, Harold's life transformed. A local news crew did eventually find him, and his quiet, dignified interview, where he spoke not about himself but about the meaning behind his flags and the importance of supporting veterans, only endeared him further to viewers. Orders began pouring in, so many that Harold knew he could never fulfill them all by himself. That's when Bobby, the tall young man, called again. "Sir, my grandfather was a tailor before he passed. He taught me a bit about sewing. I thought maybe I could help with the flags. I have some friends who would help too." Harold was hesitant at first, but something about the young man's sincere desire to make amends touched him. "Come by tomorrow morning," he said finally. "We'll see what you can do." By the end of the week, Harold had 4 young assistants working in his small apartment, learning the careful art of flag making. Bobby proved to have a natural talent for it, his long fingers surprisingly nimble with needle and thread. The others helped as they could, cutting fabric, organizing materials, and taking calls. When Harold's apartment became too cramped, the owner of a vacant storefront downtown offered them temporary space. "My father was in Vietnam too," the owner explained simply. 1 month turned into 2, then 3. Jenkins Patriots, as they now called themselves, moved into a permanent workshop space. Harold trained more veterans from the shelter to help with production, providing both income and purpose to men and women who had struggled to find their place after service. The business expanded beyond flags to other patriotic items, all handmade, all crafted with the same care and respect Harold had always shown. Each item came with a card explaining which veteran had made it, and a bit about their service. On Veterans Day, exactly 1 year after the encounter that had changed everything, Harold stood before a crowd gathered for the grand opening of the Jenkins Veterans Center, a facility offering housing and employment services for homeless veterans. funded largely by the now thriving flag business. As Harold prepared to cut the ribbon, he looked out at the faces watching him. There were his, young workers, now friends. There were veterans from the shelter, many of whom now had homes and jobs. There were community members who had supported the project, and in the back, beside a black SUV with tinted windows, stood Chuck Norris, nodding with approval. Harold held up the giant scissors, his hands steady despite his years. "This center," he said into the microphone, his voice carrying across the gathered crowd, "isn't about me. It's about respect. Respect earned through service and sacrifice." He cut the ribbon to applause and cheers. As people began to move into the new building for tours, Harold made his way through the crowd to where Norris stood. "Thank you," Harold said simply, extending his hand. Norris shook it firmly. "I didn't do anything. You had this in you all along." Harold smiled slightly. "Sometimes we just need someone to remind us who we are." Norris nodded in understanding. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching as people entered the center that would help so many who had served their country. "Not bad," Norris said finally, "for a day that started with some thoughtless mockery." "Funny how life works," Harold replied. "Sometimes the worst moments lead to the best changes." As if to emphasize his point, Bobby approached, now wearing the center's uniform shirt with assistant manager embroidered on the chest, stitching he had done himself. "Everything's ready inside, Mr. Jenkins," he said with pride. "Should I start?" "The tours?" Harold nodded, watching as the young man who had once mocked him now proudly represented everything the center stood for. "Yes," he said. "It's time to show them what respect really means."